We're going to get going. Thanks for submitting some great questions. We won't have time to go through all of them. We've given ourselves 20 minutes to answer questions, and then at 1 o'clock we will close formal proceedings, and that will be that. So Chris is going to join me up front, and we've got a few questions that we thought we'd work our way through. Thank you for voting. That makes life much easier. The first question is this: could you explain more of what you mean when you said that in the Old Testament, God's people were redeemed to a degree through David?
Yeah, thank you. In the sense that we have always been, as God's people, waiting for Jesus to fully redeem us. That was true then. Obviously, David could only do things with swords and sacrificial systems. Jesus provided the final redemption. But of course, even for us now, we haven't received the full extent of our physical redemption until Jesus returns. And so in a sense, we're always waiting as God's people for the full experience of God's redemption. But there is a seismic shift that takes place, of course, from Old Testament to New Testament as the redemption becomes complete and spiritual for us. For David's day, yeah, it was there were a lot of swords and sacrifices going on.
Well, related to that question, where in the Bible do we learn that redemption in the New Testament changes what redemption looked like in the Old Testament, rather than adding to it, e.g. physical plus spiritual? So where do we see that there is this big seismic shift?
Well, I don't think I can say much more than apart from in Jesus and the fact that we have redemption in his blood. Is the question getting at more than that, do you think?
Well, why not redemption of the Old Testament, i.e. physical blessings, plus New Testament spiritual blessings too? Why do the physical blessings not carry through? Where do we see that in the New Testament, that it's not prosperity and spiritual blessings?
I think people are probably quite convinced that we see it in the New Testament consistently, that it's not physical as well. I mean, we've seen that really recently in Mark's Gospel, haven't we, as Jesus encouraged any who would follow him to take up their cross. What did Jesus say to Peter? Straight after Jesus promised that he would receive 100-fold in this life, he said, and with it persecutions. And so physical blessings are not something that should be the norm and expectation of God's people today, physical blessings. And so that part of our redemption, we have to sort of then reassess. And we see actually, as we look back then with New Testament eyes into the Old Testament, we see that these categories of physical blessing formed a more important function than just showing temporary happiness and contentment. They showed this picture, as we've looked at, of spiritual certainty. Do you want to say anything more on that?
No, I mean, I think it's just abundantly clear, isn't it? If we listen to the teaching of Jesus and look at the life of Jesus, we are called to a life of suffering, as you said, and that's just very clear indeed. So interestingly, the blessings that God's people enjoy as they almost get a bit back to Eden by being in a land with God's presence, enjoying prosperity at certain points, point us towards the promises of a new creation. And as the New Testament goes on and describes the new creation, it picks up on those categories. Here's a technical question. We have 6 votes for this one, so here we go. How can Ruth the Moabite be included if Deuteronomy 23 verse 3 prohibited Moabites joining Israel?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So Ruth was included, so we know that it must be okay for her somehow to be included. The Deuteronomy text talks about no Moabite shall be included in the assembly of the Lord. Now, I take assembly to be, as you read that word through the Old Testament, it's a word that's then used in the New Testament as well, and is synonymous with church. It's the gathering, the assembly of God's people. So if we understand that, as I think we should in the Deuteronomy context, as the wider assembly of God's people, the gathering of God's people, no Moabite should be included. So the Moabites singled out there particularly because of their antagonism to God's people. And yet, wonderfully, through the Old Testament, again and again, we see exceptions. We see how people from outside the nation of Israel are formally embraced and included. We realize, of course, that that was always the intention, that the Gentiles would be included in God's people. But the whole point that's being made, of course, in Ruth, at 1 verse 16, when she says to Naomi, "Your people will be my people," she's saying, I no longer want to be a Moabite. I want to be a Jew. Your people, my people. Your God, my God. I'm going to have the Jewish God as my God. And so in a sense, that's her renouncing her Moabite status, which of course is always something that was open to anyone in the Old Testament. And there are lots of examples if you think about it. I mean, Caleb, I can't remember what tribe he was from, something quite obscure beginning with K, a Kenzanite or something like that. And yet he led the clan of Judah. Caleb, total hero. We're going to be hearing more about him in Joshua. I think he's a Kenzanite. Think about Moses. He married a Midianite. And then, of course, there's Ruth the Moabite and Rahab. She was a Canaanite. I mean, you can go on. So all of these exceptions, again and again, we're shown these big characters from outside of Israel being brought into Israel. That was always God's plan. And I think that's one of the big themes that you're going to pick up on in Acts.
This is making my life much easier. Hopefully most people who are going to be here tomorrow are listening, because tomorrow deals with the inclusion of Gentiles into God's people. And what you find as you get to the New Testament, as with many other areas, the Jewish nation by Jesus' day had 2,000 years of lots of laws that did seem to say you are different and distinct and there's a separation. And so the idea that Gentiles would be included at all seemed not right. But actually, as you look through the Old Testament, it is always anticipated. We do have many examples of people being brought in, and it is God's plan that the blessings of the Israelites will be extended to the nation. So,
Tom, have you just given us your sermon for tomorrow?
No, that's a bit I wasn't going to say, but it's helpful. It's helpful context. We'll assume some of that tomorrow. But it was a radical thing, even for Peter, the idea that a Gentile would be brought in. They were sort of blinded by 2,000 years of privileges as a Jewish nation.
And we sort of miss the significance of that because we're Gentiles ourselves, by and large. We're so used to the idea of being able to be included in God's people. That shock sort of is sometimes lost on us, the idea that
we've had 2,000 years of presuming on the privilege of being included, so it's harder in the opposite direction, yeah. Great. Oh, here we go. Let's keep going with questions. Why is the image of redemption through marriage so frequent in the Old Testament? How should we process this as a single person?
Yeah, thank you. Why is the image of marriage so frequent?
Of redemption through marriage, so
redemption
frequent
through
in the Old
marriage.
Testament.
Part of it is linked to, of course, the creation mandate, which carries on then through the Old Testament. Go and multiply, fill the earth. That was always God's intention as he created a people. Go and fill it. And so there was real pressure on God's people to multiply. Some people call it militant fecundity, the idea that you just have tons and tons of kids. Now, you look around some parts, particularly of America, I can see Luke here, and you will see people have just carried that on today, and you'll see Christian groups of people who truly believe it's right to have 16, 17, 18, 25 children. I mean, they exist today. People think that just continues exactly from the Old Testament to the New. I don't think that's right. I think the creation mandate, go and fill the earth with physical children, I think that changes at the Great Commission. When Jesus commissions the disciples to go and fill the earth, make disciples of all nations, we see part of this seismic shift, which I think gets to the heart of answering this question. And we see, of course, that we now fill the earth with God's people, not through militant fecundity, which requires marriage, but rather, that just means fertility, by the way, but rather through going and telling the gospel, which is wonderful, isn't it? And so we can fill the earth today as we tell people the gospel. There was something about singleness there.
How do we process that if we're a single person?
Well, it makes no difference, therefore, but I've got to be careful how I say this. But a right understanding of what's going on doesn't make an actual difference to whether we can play a part in that, whether we're single or married. Now, I realize that some people are single and not wanting to be single. Some people are married and struggling in their marriages, and the opposite will be true as well. Some people are very content in singleness. Some people have happy marriages. But whatever the situation in that, I won't comment particularly on that, other than to say anyone in any of those four situations can play their part in God's plan of filling the earth today as the gospel goes out. And so, that doesn't mean that there's necessarily instant contentment, but it does mean that there's no second-class citizen in God's economy today. And look at Jesus, as we often say, singleness embraced. Marriage in heaven won't exist apart from all of our individual marriages with the Lamb for eternity.
We've got a question that's picked up on the sort of distinction in terms of redemption and how that cashes out in the New Testament, which is a new one, so you've not had a chance to look at it. But the Old Testament people expected both physical and spiritual blessings as a mark of being God's chosen ones. That is true, but you might want to comment on the fact that the spiritual blessings weren't the same degree as ours. The question goes on. Whereas New Testament people should expect spiritual blessings plus physical persecution. Why? Why that difference? Why delay the physical blessings?
What would you say to that?
Well, I think on the first question, it's not exactly right to say it was like for like in terms of spiritual blessings. Pentecost sees the outpouring of God's Spirit on God's New Testament people, on his people who are then sent out into the world as prophets on a level with the Old Testament prophets to serving God's redeeming purposes to bring people to Christ. So the privilege is immense. And we have God himself now living in us, not just in a sort of temple by tokens in Jerusalem. So it's not exactly the same that they enjoyed spiritual blessings too. So that's the first thing. The second thing, why do we suffer now? Well, because, in part at least, it brings glory to God as God's people live by faith and trust in him and his promises and endure these persecutions. It is a testimony to God and to his salvation that his people are even able to bear these sufferings. So Ephesians talks of the church being a display of God's wisdom in the heavenly places. So we right now are being watched by the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places, maybe angels, certainly God's spiritual enemies, and he's showing off through the church. And one of the ways he does show off is as we endure and stand firm in the faith, showing the power of God, the goodness of God, that we trust him because his salvation is so great. So that's part of an answer. Revelation sort of picks up on that as it encourages Christians to endure. And would you add anything?
Well, just that we see another big category change, of course, in terms of the way that God wants to display his glory. And he displays his glory, surprisingly, through the cross in the New Testament. And so, again, this is a category change. The things that the world doesn't expect are the things that God uses to display his perfect godness. You may remember, if you were here when we went through 1 Corinthians, that idea comes up again and again. In 1 Corinthians 1, verse 20, where is the wise, where is the scribe, the debtor of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? And of course, how is God's wisdom displayed? It's through the cross. And Paul writes, 1 Corinthians 1, verse 18, the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us being saved, it is the power of God. And so we see God's power, God's glory, everything that God has most perfectly in store for his people summed up in the cross. And so it's no coincidence, of course, that Jesus tells us that we as his followers must take up that cross. And so that idea of suffering and persecution and weakness is tied up in glory, which the world just doesn't get, because the world just thinks it's got to be about good times.
Yeah. John's gospel picks up on that Christ's sufferings are glorious, part of God's redemptive purposes, and we are caught up in that pattern of suffering, serving God's redemptive purposes. It's a great question, whoever asked it.
Yeah, it's really good.
I've slightly lost where we got to, though. So Ruth might, no, that's only got 2 votes. Let's see the one above. We are physical beings. The lack of physical needs, food, friendship, shelter, may cause sadness, though we have all spiritual blessings. How do we handle this sadness?
Sadness if we don't have
So
some of those
just the
things.
sadness that comes from, although we are provided for, we may lack physical needs to a degree, food, shelter, friendship, that kind of thing. How do we handle that when it's tough times?
Yeah, I mean, God's people around the world today are, some of us as God's family are suffering today, and we'll be aware of organizations like Open Doors, which draws our attention to some of the hardships being faced by Christians today who don't have some of those basic essentials. It's not the normal situation for God's people today. The normal situation for God's people today, as has always been, is God's people are given the essentials of life, not necessarily everything we want, but certainly everything we need. And I think that's what the teaching is primarily about, all of the things that we need. Ultimately, it's all the things that we need to get us to our final and full redemption. And so, yeah, there will be some deficiencies along the way, some inadequacies, some things that may cause lack of content. But God will keep us all the way to the end. And I guess at that point, as we read many times, we will truly be able to say, I mean, all of the inadequacies that we experience in this life, all the setbacks, will pale into relative insignificance compared to everything we experience in heaven. And I think that the point that we keep needing to come back to is that mindset is available to us now as we grasp the wonder and the joy of what Jesus has achieved. And I know that, some of the testimonies that you read on websites like Open Doors of Christians who are suffering with very, very little or being deprived, for example, any type of sort of social interaction if they're held in solitary confinement, that sort of thing. And yet they talk about huge, huge joy of their relationship in God. It's a huge challenge to us in the West who have been blessed physically in so many ways.
Great. There's one question which is new and has jumped right to the top, so I'm going to go back to the top. How can we speak helpfully about refuge as New Testament Christians to non-Christians? What are we to refuge from, e.g. God's wrath, isn't as clear?
Yeah. It's a good question. I think for today in our world, one of the reasons why people that you work with, wider friends and family, one of the reasons that they have absolutely no interest in hearing anything more about Christianity is because they don't believe that there's any type of accountability in the end. The world increasingly believes that when you die, you rot. And if it even thinks that far, even to start talking in those categories is an irrelevance to lots of people, and they just want to sort of stick their head in the sand and just get on with today. And the choices on Netflix are much more interesting than discussions about bigger life. And so I think it's a lack of understanding of judgment that primarily drives the reality that nobody is interested in refuge. So I think we need to talk in terms of judgment that makes sense. I would suggest the way to start a conversation on judgment is to start a conversation on Jesus and the resurrection. The resurrection proves that there will be a judgment. Jesus rose from the dead. That's an undeniable fact. And people that want to just say that didn't happen are up against a big, big problem. So that's the starting point. The fact that Jesus rose from the dead means there is accountability. There is a day of return. He'll come back. He's still alive. You're accountable to him. He made you. And so I think that's maybe an acceptable way in. That then drives the primary aim of people understanding judgment as a result of our sin, which of course then gives the wonderful hope of refuge that is available in Jesus. I think that's a more successful way to go in. I think if you go in with felt needs and satisfaction and, the church can really help you with things, that is true. But I think that's even more of an irrelevance to people around. You'll have to be the judge of that. Both of those things are true. There is refuge to a degree now, and the church can certainly help. Our relationship with God now is a reality, but ultimately it's understanding the eternal nature of our souls.